core message to brands and sellers and the entrepreneurs that you do so much for is act now. Don't wait. If you wait 5 years, it's too late. Start putting your quilt together with your patchwork of different countries based on different capabilities and start working on it now. Because if you wait a couple years, 3 years, 5 years, you're really in for a world of hurt. Welcome to the Day 2 podcast for my special guest, Steve Simonson, to talk about big trouble in big China. Every Amazon seller is touched one way or another by China. Our guest will help us break down what's going on, the risks involved with doing business in China, and more importantly, as a seller, as a brand, what to do about it. I'm Jason Boyce, founder and CEO of Avenue 7 Media and host of the Day 2 podcast. With me today is my good friend, Steve Simonson. Steve's company's I should have never used that word. Steve's companies perennially rank on the Inc. 500 fastest growing company list, as well as the Internet Top 500. Steve was also the finalist in an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award. You had my vote. Not that I get to vote, but you should have got it, Steve. Steve manages several companies from his holding company, SimoGlobal.com. That's SYMO Global.com. He is the founder of the e-commerce association cooperative, Empowery, and offers free entrepreneurial support via his website and podcast platform, awesomers.com, spelled just like awesome with an ERS at the end.com. And let me tell you guys, you can't do better than getting entrepreneurial advice from my friend Steve Simonson. The reason Steve is joining us today is because of his extensive knowledge about global trade, more specifically with the issues affecting Southeast Asia and China. I don't know anyone as knowledgeable as Steve on China, and I asked him to join us today to break down what the fuck is going on in China. Steve, how are you doing today?
Man, I am good, and loving being here. Thank you for the invite. It is a crazy time in the world, and China especially is trying to rank number one in the crazy.
That's a tall order, given all the crazy around the world right now. But they're making a good showing, aren't they, Steve? What's the latest in the news? I was glued to the TV set last night, which would have been Sunday before Cyber Monday. We're going to try to get this out quickly, so I have no problem telling everyone what day it is. We're here together on Cyber Monday, of all days, us two e-commerce guys. And Steve, break down some of the news that you're seeing, not only in the news reports, but what you're seeing is going on right now in China.
Well, it's interesting. Western media is now catching up to a rapidly developing story. And the story essentially is there's a small scale, and everything's relative in China. So we can talk about
how only half a billion people instead of 3 billion.
That's right. There's something called the white paper revolution that has unfolded, if I can use a paper metaphor. And that's something that is not common in China. And what is common is people voicing dissent or, hey, I'm mad about this housing policy, or I'm mad that you're bulldozing my neighborhood to make way for a dam, or I'm mad that this bank stole my money, so I'm going to protest. But the protests usually take a very specific form. I'm mad about this policy, and I'm asking you, the benevolent CCP, to please help me. And even if they scream and whatever, right, that's kind of they're like, hey, big brother, please help me. And this is totally different. There's been no protests of this type in China proper. I'm not talking about Hong Kong, since Tiananmen Square. Now, Tiananmen Square, the scale was way, way larger. Way, way larger. And maybe this builds to something, or maybe it goes away. We'll decide that here in a minute.
Yeah.
But the idea that somebody, and not just one somebody, many somebodies across many, many cities in China are stepping up and saying, Xi Jinping, step down. CCP, step down. We want democracy, not dictatorship. We want freedom, not oppression. End the lockdowns. End the lockdowns. It is something that I have never seen ever in 20 plus years inside of China. And by the way, it's extraordinarily dangerous. When you say something like step down Xi Jinping, one of the chants that they were chanting is F your mother, Xi Jinping, or F the CCP. Like, this is dangerous stuff. Not like, oh, this is rude. This is dangerous.
It's a great point, Steve. Here in the United States, we take our freedoms for granted. I mean, I can't drive anywhere without seeing an F Trump or an F Biden bumper sticker on somebody's car. That just doesn't happen in China. So the fact that Chinese citizens with everything to lose are out there and vocally putting this on signs, saying these things out loud is really a big change from anything we've seen since Tiananmen Square. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, for sure. It's unprecedented from the standpoint of the Xi Jinping reign. He's been in power, let's say roughly 10 years.
Yeah.
And nothing has happened like this during his tenure. And the last time of something this substantial has happened from a social unrest perspective is Tiananmen Square. And that was, very, very large scale. No data out of China is ever accurate, so you have to piece together little clues you get from China and clues you get from outsiders and clues you get from people who were on the ground that had to sneak the info out. But, in Tiananmen Square, well over 10,000 people were killed during that the beatdown phase of that operation.
10,000 people were murdered in Tiananmen Square or countrywide?
Well, around the Beijing area related directly to the Tiananmen Square. They call it the Tiananmen Square massacre, not because one or two people got hurt, but a significant number. Now, I wasn't on the ground. I'm using various data sources and what I believe are credible data sources at that. So that was historic in nature, and this has the makings of history as well. But I think it's probably useful to fly back just a little bit and figure out how we got here, if that's beneficial to you and the game.
Yeah, I want to, just for some historical context, the Tiananmen Square protests were 1989. The visual that I have in my head, Steve, is that incredibly brave Chinese citizen standing in front of a tank and the tank stopping and turning and going around them. And in my head, the protest happened only in Beijing. Were they countrywide in the Tiananmen Square revolt? Because it seems like the white paper protests are happening everywhere in China.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to portray myself as a history expert, but the Tiananmen Square situation was largely Beijing and in Tiananmen Square proper. Like that's where a lot of the crowds gathered, and that's where Tank Man, that's how they refer to him as Tank Man.
Yeah,
he was just like unbelievably just standing in front. Almost, I don't know if he had groceries or what he had in those bags, but he's like, "No, you're not going forward, Tank." And it was a sight to see. The difference here is, in fact, it is, I can't say nationwide, but it is incredibly widespread. And you have it happening in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, cities that many Westerners have heard of, but many other cities Westerners have never heard of.
Right.
The Chongqing and Hefei and Urumqi or Umachi. I can't pronounce that one right. But that's actually in Xinjiang region. There's a little town. It's relative in China, right?
A little town, only 2 million people.
A little village of 1.79 million people. I actually don't know what tier, if it's tier 1 through 5 city, but Urumqi, I'm not exactly how you pronounce it. It's Umuqi. This city basically had a tragedy happen, and it was last week. And essentially, a fire broke out in a high-rise, and the firefighters could not get to the building because of all the barriers for COVID. And not only that, the people can't get out of the building because their doors are literally barred and welded and otherwise, completely shut. So you got a fire, people can't get out, and help can't get in.
I think 10 people dead as of this morning.
Those are the official numbers. I would assume it's worse, to be honest with you.
Oh, you have to assume everything is worse with China because they just sugarcoat those numbers. You're absolutely right. So let's back up for a second, Steve.
Sure, please.
Like you said, let's back up. Let's talk about how we got here. When we were talking about doing a podcast together, and by the way, Steve, I hope this is the first of many with us on the Day 2 podcast. I was thinking, well, okay, here comes another COVID lockdown. A third of the country is shut down because, a couple hundred people got COVID. And I thought that's what we were going to be talking about. But that quickly morphed into this terrible accident with the apartment building. Let's explain for our viewers from your perspective what you know with all your people on the ground in China. How has COVID been different for the Chinese And how has the Chinese government handled that differently than the way we've handled it here?
Yeah, so it's useful to talk about. Part of the protest,
Steve,
by the
I'm sorry to interrupt again. Is it
Sure.
safe to say that all of these protests really they started with COVID? Is it safe to say that as you break down what's happening in China with COVID restrictions?
Well, no question that like they've built the tinderbox ready to go because of COVID, right? And
Right.
then it just takes a simple spark to set off the whole thing. And everybody's got a breaking point. I mean, we're dealing with humanity here, and everybody's got a breaking point. So, in one of the protests over the weekend in Wuhan, they said they were chanting things like, "The pandemic started here. Let's end it here." As they're knocking over quarantine testing centers and barricades and beating back the Dabai, which are called the big whites. So if you see these quarantine or better said pandemic workers, they're in the white medical looking uniforms with the blue tape most often.
With
Those are called
like a
Dabai.
full body suit, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it looks like they're going into some sort of quarantine situation. So anyway, so Wuhan says we're going to beat this thing, it started here, let's end it here. And when the pandemic first started, basically China put a containerization idea around itself. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. Of course, they did that about a week after they let 5 million people leave Wuhan.
Right.
Not to travel within the country. All
over the
buses and
world.
trains in the country were shut down, but international flights were still okay.
Thank you
And
very
so we seeded the rest of the world. And again, I'm not here to talk about conspiracy theories, but it sure sounds like a good movie. The whole point is once that thing got out, then they wanted to keep it out. And so they did a really hard process of lockdown. And, because everybody's on WeChat, they really do have the understanding of contact tracing and all these things that we could never get in a Western place due to privacy. So they have effectively had it locked down. They were super long in terms of return quarantines and things like that. But over time, things have gotten a little more porous. Hong Kong is a little more porous, and Macau is a little more porous. And sure enough, the COVID doesn't always cooperate the way you want it to. You think a 5-day quarantine or a 21-day quarantine or whatever quarantine works, but it doesn't always. And so now things have leaked through the system.
Yeah.
This has become then a potential two-part problem. One part is we've got a health potential issue, and the Chinese health system is not what I would rate as exceptional. And number two, we've got a face situation. They were running last year at this time, and the years may be running into my head, but at some point they were running movies about how great the Chinese system was and how wonderful they did, and how the U.S. and other places in the Western world were stupid, and they're good and we're bad. And so they had the victory lap, and it was all done. Now, when they watched the World Cup on TV, the first few days, they didn't realize that people would see the crowds of, soccer fans, football fans,
Without
maskless,
masks.
having the greatest time of their life, enjoying life. And so, in fact, after the first couple days, they started cutting out. First, they blurred the crowd so you couldn't see them. Yeah. Then they actually changed the feed of the World Cup to not include crowd shots. It would cut to up close on the bench or at refs or coaches or whatever. Like, they have completely different feed from the World Cup. So the World Cup is also a factor of going, why is the rest of the world looking good and we suck? That's part of the so
that was a
COVID
trigger.
for
The
sure.
World Cup was actually a trigger for these folks that have been living under, to say draconian is probably not strong enough, draconian circumstances since COVID started in 2020. It's almost 20. We're 6 weeks away from, we're 5 weeks away from 2023. So these folks are like, wait a minute, in Qatar, people are having a good time and our life still sucks, and I'm locked inside my apartment building from the outside.
Yeah, in fairness, there was a time for the first year and a half or so, maybe even 2 years, that it was relatively free in China, right?
Yeah.
Much less quarantining, much less testing. You could even travel around inside of China and be on vacation. It was not too bad. But once the porous nature and the Omicron, which is like infinitely higher, contagion rate than than the original variants. Well, people would just get flash lockdown. Like literally, somebody would test positive for COVID in a shopping mall. Now everybody's in the shopping mall or Disneyland. Like you're locked in until everybody gets tested, and then we separate, the good from the bad, and so
you
on.
can check in, but you can't never leave.
You cannot
Eagles
check
like
out,
to
right?
say. Got it. Oh man, that's awful. So before the Omicron, that was kind of the shift. So maybe by 2020 to deep into 2021, we're okay. Then Omicron hits, and then they go back to even stricter lockdown than they were in the early phases of 2020. Is that what I'm hearing, Steve?
Yeah. So the very first part of 2020, it was draconian, and let's weld your door, and anybody who moves gets wrecked.
I'm sorry. Did you say weld your door?
Yeah, weld. So there's many videos of. So I was going to point this out. When you talk about the word draconian and we think of, well, lockdown's not awesome, many Westerners go, oh yeah, I remember that time I had to wear a mask in the grocery store and it pissed me off. And that's not what we're talking about.
No.
We're talking about you can't leave your house for 100 days. And sometimes they will drop off food to your house, but not always. And so Shanghai had the first example. So as Omicron started to spread early in 2021, even official reported numbers started going up, and Shanghai, being a very international city, had some breakthrough cases. And so they started locking down the city. Now, by the way, revisionist history in China will tell you, oh, no, we never locked it down. But some neighborhoods spontaneously went to what they call static management. That code word is lockdown for everybody. So
you welded your door shut for 100 days.
Around an apartment building, they put big walls or barriers, and they will not always, but often weld your door or put metal locks or whatever. Like there ain't no getting out of there. It's like a little prison.
Yeah.
So Shanghai went through this lockdown in the spring where at night people would bang pots and pans and they would sing songs and they would try to rally together just to have some sense of, humanity, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And one night as they're out there singing and banging on pots and pans, the drones start coming in and the drones are like, start following public policy. This is not okay. And one of the best translations, and it's accurate, I've had it tested multiple times, the drone says, control your soul's desire for freedom, right? Oh. And like what a heart-wrenching
let's
thing.
sit with that for a second. Control your soul's desire for freedom. These drones were audibly sending this message via the air through these neighborhoods and these high-rise buildings.
Absolutely, yeah, no question about that. So that was indicative of the nature of kind of the problem, but the humanity of we're trying to just live here, and then the kind of the beatdown that followed. So a lot of people saw Shanghai, which is the richest city and is the most metropolitan, and they saw that and they're like, ooh, I hope that doesn't happen to me. And so as any scares would happen in the future, and by the way, there are many things that you could possibly not imagine. If you happen to be in a public toilet when they ran the tape bike for quarantine zone, that's where you're quarantining. If you happen to have your kid 5 feet in front of you and you were 5 feet behind them and the tape ran between you, you're now in separate quarantine areas. Oh. It's unbelievable. So wow. This is a level of lockdown and kind of COVID restriction that nobody could imagine. And I'm not even telling you the hardest parts of it. I mean, if I told you some of the stuff, you would absolutely.
Well, give us one. Give us one more, Steve. This is already horrifying.
It's a nightmare.
I can only
imagine. Let me just give you an example. So if you are in a building, and this building, maybe I'll give you two examples. Here's
like an apartment building
version.
Or a factory.
Yeah, so you're in an apartment building. You're living in this building.
Okay.
Nobody in the building has COVID. And you know because you get your WeChat shows you red, yellow, green if you can move or not. And every 2 days everybody lines up back to back, shoulder to shoulder to get quarantine tests or to get COVID tests. So most idiotic policy ever. we're quarantining, and then we mash them all together in massive lines.
So everyone in that line now has it. If one person has it.
If one person has it, then everybody's got it. Yeah. And even better, it takes some time to incubate, so it spreads, over the course of time. So
yeah,
many of the policies conflict. So anyway, this building, it's all 100% okay. And then somebody shows up and goes, you know what? We're going to need this building for quarantine. All you guys are going to have to move out of here. And then they literally move in people to quarantine in that building. Building.
In their home.
Your home.
They kick the people who are living there, who are COVID-free, out to bring people who have, to get.
Yeah, based on some regionalization, like, this is happening, it's spreading, we're trying to control in this neighborhood. Yep. And so we're going to take people out of the equation. So really nutty stuff. Those who were removed from their own homes and had to go quarantine, often their stuff is ransacked. They've had stuff stolen. Yeah. The quarantine guys come in with whatever the insecticide, or I shouldn't say insecticide, but whatever the antimicrobial stuff is, bleach type stuff, and just destroys most of their property in the house. It's just terrible. So, and by the way, if you happen to have a pet, that pet is not going to quarantine with you. They literally take the pet outside and, let's say, not humanely end that pet's existence.
You're kidding.
Not kidding. The videos of this are just the most heartbreaking thing ever. So,
well, Steve, recapping this is a lot of built up frustration. I mean, some of the stories that you're sharing right now are unimaginable to most U.S. citizens, most European citizens. So we've got this situation. We've got COVID 2020. We've got a big lockdown. And by the way, you're in a horrific lockdown, and your government is telling you, oh, this isn't really us, it's you, right? It's not really happening. What you're seeing in reality is not really the truth. You need to suppress your soul's desire for freedom, literally as a government message being repeated via drones. This is like a bad post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie. And this is all building this frustration. Then you go onto the World Cup game and go, wait a minute, the rest of the world is back to normal and I'm stuck here in this hell. All right, so now let's layer on. So now I'm getting it. I'm starting to get why this is bubbling over a little bit. Let's talk about Xi Jinping, the leader of China right now, for a minute. I've been listening to a fascinating podcast put on by The Economist called The Prince. And it's kind of his story. If you haven't heard it already, Steve, I imagine you already have. I would suggest you listen to it if you're interested more about how this guy came into power. So let's talk about what Xi has done differently and tie in, the COVID frustrations and that buildup. And then you got President Xi coming in and doing some things that are not really normal. Well, can you break that down a little bit? And how does that tie into the white paper protests that we're seeing now?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll be able to do the full tie-in, but Xi Jinping has now been in power for 2 sessions of the People's Congress. They go in 5-year kind of segments,
which is usually the limit for everyone. They usually bounce after the 10th year, right?
That is correct. Yeah, but hey, good news for those of you who are worried. He's found a loophole, and now he is into his 3rd term, and it doesn't look like there's any end to that term in his future. So many of the things he's done in terms of being different have started to unfold in the last, let's say, 5 years. He is less and less open market and open China, and more warrior diplomacy. In the old days, the diplomatic structure in China was, hey, we're a developing country, give us a break, we're trying to get things done. Whether that was true or false or genuine or authentic is irrelevant. That was the play. Now it's like,
we're a superpower.
Australia said, hey, somebody should look into how this coronavirus thing got started. And China said immediately, Australia is the gum under China's shoe. Right, that was their response, and they cut off like coal imports from Australia and beef imports and other things to punish Australia. Ironically, running them out of power last winter. So many of the blackouts were related to that reprisal. The whole point is the openness is reducing, and the entrepreneurial freedoms that existed on some level, particularly in tech, have been beat down. Right, so Jack Ma beat down. Any kind of tech entrepreneur and in fairness, or at least to balance this, people in the entertainment sector, people in the technology sector are often backed by some of Xi Jinping's adversaries. So it's not just him trying to create common prosperity. Like, I'm not just taking from billionaires and giving it out to the people. He's trying to beat down some of his bad guys or his adversaries. So all of this just means the infighting and some of the problems. Xi Jinping fundamentally now understands one thing: the Chinese are kind of terminally in a free fall in terms of demography, population. So it's estimated now, even with some of the fake census data that we see, luckily there's so much complex data that nobody can ever fake it all kind of accurately. And so you're able to take stuff out. And even the official stuff that's coming out is pretty catastrophic for China. Somewhere between 2050 and 2060, China will have half the population it does today.
Okay,
Half.
wait a minute. So they're going to cut their population will cut in half by 2050, roughly?
Yes. Yeah. Let's call it 2055, just for a round in the middle there.
So all of a
Half.
sudden, the world's factory that had limitless cheap labor is already seeing the signs of less availability in labor. If the population cuts in half, what does that do to the cost of labor?
Correct. Actually, it's already happened. Not only has the demography tipped over, they're the oldest population on planet Earth, even now surpassing Japan and aging more rapidly than any other population. So it's happened. From the time I started buying in China, labor is up 15 times. So Xi Jinping understands this, that we have a terminal problem when it comes to cheap labor. It no longer exists.
Yeah.
Secondly, they've got a capital, let's call it financial structure problem. Many parts of their economy, the GDP, if you will, rely on government spending. So there's a big amount of infrastructure spending that has gone on, but with diminishing returns like you can't believe. Right? The so-called ghost cities and bridges to nowhere, like these are big capital-intensive projects that government puts on, but they have no ROI. It's impossible to have a bridge that cost you $100 million in the remote wilderness that 2 trains go on over a week. There's no ROI on that. So that capital spending eventually has to slow down. And then the other thing is real estate, which is crashing rapidly because of any number of things. But just think of their real estate like a pyramid scheme. And so that's 50% roughly, if you put those two things, government capital spending and real estate together. That's about 50% of their GDP, and all of that is in disarray. So because Xi Jinping
just burst in the real estate market, of course, and
not only is it burst, it's like collapsing. Recently, they just in this past week they've come out with a policy that is in the brand of too big to fail. Like, here's all these big government-owned developers, Country Garden and Wonka and some of these others. Yeah. And we're going to put in $160 billion US dollars of money into these guys to keep them afloat. Oh. And we can dive into real estate if we want. But the point is, the economic engine that was kind of great for China. Like, you could go to China and go, hey, what about this communism? Are you guys happy with this? They're like, hey, my life's a hell of a lot better than my parents' life and a hell of a lot better than it was 20 years ago. I'm in. I'm down.
Yep. So,
and it's hard to argue with that economic progress.
Yep.
However, as you start to look into things like tofu dreg is a term that one of the former Chinese presidents said. You would go to a road or a building or some structure that was one of these capital projects, and it turns out they're garbage. They're made poorly. They fall down. And there are bridges and tunnels and buildings that routinely just kind of disintegrate over there. So my whole point is, as all of these wins start to fade away, that's when Xi Jinping says, and again, I'm not in his head, I'm also not on his advisory board, but it's natural, and we've seen other leaders do this, to go, my next play is going nationalistic. It's going to, the mothership needs to be protected, and all these outsiders are the enemy. Let's rally around that. So it's quite complex, but all of this has quite negative ramifications for if you buy stuff in China. So any any seller that sources products there. It's also quite negative in terms of predictability for the supply chain. Right now, today, 410 million people are in some form of lockdown in China. That's a lot of people.
I heard some report that came out over the weekend that said about a third of China is on lockdown.
Yeah,
And
so they have about 1.2 billion people. That was
yes, that sounds about
precise math.
right. That math
Yeah.
adds up. That's a third of the country. And here we are just finally coming out of all these supply chain shocks to the system, largely driven by COVID, but also more importantly, driven by China, because they are our factory for so many of the goods that we bring into the country. And now here we are again on an unrealistic lockdown. And, at the end of the day, I keep coming back to Confucianism and this idea of saving face, of being such a detriment to the prospects of the Chinese people. And, here we have a vaccine, right? A vaccine that the Chinese developed that anyone in health and human services in the United States would say just doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
There's certainly no variant. There's no Omicron variant. And it's almost like they're trying to hide the fact that their vaccine doesn't work. If they would just buy whatever the most recent variant vaccine is here in the United States, import it and vaccinate their people, maybe they wouldn't have to have these lockdowns. But again, they got to save face. You talk about how we've got to look like we're this big industrial, we're not a third world anymore. We're a first world, we're a superpower. We've got the bridges to nowhere, countless bridges to nowhere. We've got the bullet trains, which, I remember going even 6 or 7 years ago, or even 10 years ago, Steve, and you probably remember this. You show up and one day there's like a pond, and the next time you go, next year you go to your trip to the same region and like, holy crap, they built a bullet train in a year that I was gone. How did they do this? And the same thing with these cities. I remember driving through these enormous, impressive looking cities, but as you got closer and closer, you realize it's a ghost town. Nobody's living in the city. There's dozens of these high-rise buildings that were created, and there's no life. No one's around. So again, it's like this paper tiger development in order to save face and look like we're bigger and better than we actually are. And that's got to tie back to Xi in some level, right? I mean, we've got a decade under Xi here going on the next 5 years. How does this tie back to him, and what has he done differently than, say, Hu Jintao did previously?
Well, again, a lot of it has to do with how much entrepreneurial freedom the people inside of China have access to. Yeah. So many factory owners are essentially entrepreneurs. Now, a lot of them rely on kind of guanxi, government relationships and other things to shake hands. And it's like, hey, we're going to need a little business over here, or I'm going to need some loans that are forgiven later. So there's still that kind of relationship. But a lot of these people are really hard workers. They found ways of sourcing products or building products.
Yep.
And they just got things going.
Yeah.
And regardless of how much government subsidization there was on exports or any of the rest of it, it was a smart strategy to, for Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and some of these others to say, if people want to buy stuff, let's sell it, because that's bringing in an awful lot of new money to us. And that reality of what was built drove their economic engine for, the last 30 years. But part of what they call it the one-child policy dividend. When you don't have young people to waste money on diapers and daycares and all this stuff, there's a dividend that society gets of just, hey, we can put money into all these other things. Obviously, you need people, you need labor, you need people to make babies enough. Yeah. That's just one good reason. So he's changed some of those policies to try to stimulate people having kids. I think it was 2017 or 18 when the one-child policy disappeared. Now you can have 2 kids. Last year sometime they're like, 3 kids, no problem. And by the way, if you're a party member, you should have 3 kids. That's being a good party member, right? They're really now pushing that. And what used to be forced abortions are now, we're going to outlaw those because we need the kids, right? So many changes. And part of the
horror stories.
Yeah, just you can't even imagine. Part of the Xi changes comes in the form of how much economic freedom do people think that they have. regardless of reality. And this is perhaps the biggest threat to China is if the entrepreneurs think that they're going to build something and it's going to be taken away from them, why build it?
Yeah.
Most of the best minds and the biggest companies and those, let's just say, that would think in the most innovative ways are like, what's the point if it's going to be taken away? And if I'm going to be disappeared or if I have to flee. So many of them are just trying to get their money out of China in some way and move out. And so there's a big brain drain, both in terms of foreign talent and the entrepreneurial talent. And this is something that I think lands on Xi Jinping himself, because he really is sending terror through the minds of all of the innovation class.
Yeah, that's right. The innovation class. Well said, Steve. Bringing it back to sort of the Amazon seller, right? And the brands who depend on China as a factory and as a source. I know you bring a lot of containers in. How many containers are you bringing in from China every year now? Hundreds?
Well, yeah, it's definitely, it's, maybe a couple thousand or so.
Okay.
We don't really count them that close, but we move a little volume.
So thousands. And, I remember this story back, I think I was buying saunas from a factory in the north at one point. And I remember going out to dinner with the factory boss and his people. And I was stunned by something that he told me. He told me that, hey, you keep negotiating with me on price. I don't make a penny on my price to you. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. How do you keep your business going? He goes, well, for every purchase order that I give to you, I get 30% back from the government. So I make my entire profit margin comes from the government. And now I'm reminded of what you said earlier, Steve, where you're saying, hey, the real estate bust, which is where a lot of that government revenue comes from. You got labor costs going through the roof. You've got capital constraints happening from the Chinese government. If those checks dry up from the government to the factory, what is that going to do to the factory base? And then also, what is that going to do to inflation, which is already at record highs?
Well, that already has dried up largely. Most export credits have been phased out over the course of recency. Then you add on top of it, by the way, tariffs, right? We all have the rude awakening of tariffs that add additional costs. The reality is, at this time, there are more bankruptcies happening of businesses in China and just companies disappearing than ever before. And this is not a good sign. Typically, more businesses are started in China by far, maybe 10x, or maybe it's 5x, than those who close down. And so there's always this new crop of businesses just, being explosive growth. But that has reversed. It's now far more are deregistering, bankrupting, disappearing. And that means there's much more risk to an Amazon seller these days.
Yeah.
This is not the same as me saying, don't buy from China. I still buy some stuff from China, but I'm trying to find some balance between managing my risk in China, and we do it different than the average seller, I'm sure, and then also having redundancy in other parts of the world. Because, listen, in 5 years, you are not going to be able to send a PO to China and have the same kind of automatic, here's my product, here's the shipment. Like, it's just not going to be there in 5 years.
Out the door in 45 days, it'll be at your place. Right. 60, yeah.
That already disintegrated during COVID, but to the extent that it's coming back, like right now, most of the factories we deal with in China are down 40 to 50% in terms of total volume.
Oh.
So you may hear things like, oh, we're going on Chinese New Year early this year. That means they have no orders, right? So there are lots of things that are happening that are quite detrimental to that core economic system that they have.
And that's happening, A, because of COVID, B, because the support that they used to get from the government under Xi's regime and under their regional governor's regime is not what it used to be. Is it fair to say that those are the two drivers? Well, I guess, and we also talked about the increase in labor, right? So is that the trifecta here that's really driving these folks out of business?
For sure, those are like the triggers. But you have three things you need to make a product, to run a factory. You need power, you need people, and you need raw materials. Yep. Power is becoming increasingly difficult to produce in China at a reasonable cost. And at a certain point last year, for example, during the winter, it cost power factories double what they could sell it for. And so their solution is stop selling it and let them have blackouts. Because why should we keep losing money, right? Even if they're a government-backed thing, they run out of money at some point. Yeah. So power is a problem, and that is a significant issue for China going forward. The ability to continue to power their economy. Labor is increasing price and decreasing supply. Young people do not want to go work at factories.
No.
They want to work white-collar jobs, and those are much, much harder to find. So you've got a general labor issue there. And then even raw materials, largely China is not a producer of raw materials. They import raw materials, and then they assemble or otherwise construct a final product. Their imports in China are down dramatically in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 months, which is a leading indicator of future exports from China being down in a significant way. So all of those factors, and by the way, the other little caveat on raw materials is if you are having inflationary pressures that are related to external wars or just commoditization, prices going higher, globally, oil and whatnot, you got a problem, right? All of these are pressures. Mm-hmm. And so at some point, you just have to look and you say, well, how is that China price compared to the Vietnam price or compared to the India price or the Mexico price or the price in your home market? Maybe it's the United States or England or wherever.
So, Steve, I keep thinking because of COVID, things are going to get better in China. But now after talking to you for the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I'm not so sure. And you're saying that, are you saying, is your projection that it's going to continue to be this bad over the next 5 years, or is it going to progressively get worse over the next 5 years?
So
I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball now, Steve. I won't hold you to it, but
no, I just got it out of the shop. It's looking good. Yeah, my future predicting. So I did a bunch of predictions when I was doing some speeches last year, where I talked about basically around the September, October timeframe last year. I said, if you didn't like COVID, the pandemic part 1, you're going to hate the sequel, right? It's going to be a nightmare. And this is exactly what we're living in now. And by the way, it doesn't take really a crystal ball to see this. It's like, it's just cause and effect. You can't keep doing this policy without these ramifications. So I'm saying quite clearly, and listen, people can believe me or not believe me. I don't really care. I'll be fine because I'm taking action based on my guesses. It's never going to be this good again, right? So it's going to continue to decline in subtle, nuanced ways. There's a lot of really brilliant, wonderful people in China, incredible factory owners. The smartest ones are setting up in Malaysia or Vietnam or Thailand or elsewhere to try to diversify their risk. There are things that are happening inside of China that we simply can't control and even understand from the outside. The demography and the financial and the things that I just can't predict. But I don't think it's going to ever be better than it is today, and it will slowly and subtly decline. As a macro picture, that's true. But on a micro level, for an individual seller, if you're sending a deposit, someday you have a higher risk. Maybe that risk was 5% in the past. It's going to go to 20% or 30%. So every third order, you might get screwed on somebody just disappearing with your deposit. So paying in advance is becoming more and more dangerous. And if you do it at volume and you have any sort of scale, it's idiotic to do it like that.
Steve, in my 15 years of buying stuff from China and having stuff made in factories in China, I never one time did I have a PO not deliver. And you're saying
exactly
that was a 5% risk before. Now that's a 20% chance. You got a 1 in 5 chance that if you cut a PO, you may not get it because that factory is just going to shut its doors and take off. That factory boss is going to take whatever cash he can grab and go somewhere else. Wow.
Even if the factory boss spent on raw materials but now can't produce it.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily a nefarious criminal enterprise suddenly. And by the way, I'm not actually running the true odds, but I'm giving you the scale. It could be 5 to 10 times worse risk going forward than it was in the past. And that means some people are going to be fine and other people are not going to be fine.
Yeah.
We are seeing much, much higher risk. And anybody who deals at scale, when we have conversations, we're like, if you are not paying on terms, you are absolutely risking you're breaching your fiduciary duty as if you have a large enough enterprise.
Yeah.
If this is a small thing and you're spending 10 or 20 grand occasionally, then have people on the ground. Make sure that I'm going to send you 10%, you buy the raw materials. I'm going to send you 20%. And by the way, you have somebody go check. Yeah, they got the raw materials. And then it's like, now we're going into production. I'm going to send you another 20%. Go there on the 14th. Make sure they're producing our stuff. Yeah, it's all. So you're checking more and more frequently. So there are ways to deal with it and mitigate that risk to some extent. One of those ways is, what are the alternatives?
Yeah.
That's a number one way.
So let's talk about that, Steve. If you feel that we've reached peak China and it's downhill from here in terms of quality, production capabilities, ease of manufacturing and receiving goods here into the United States and Europe, if you look at your business 5 years from now, what percentage do you think of your goods will still be produced in China? Or are you going from where you're at today to 0 in 5 years? And then what are some steps? What other areas, what other countries are you going to in order to diversify your supply chain to protect yourself about what's coming? Or in some cases, we're already here, but what's coming down the road looks like it's much worse than what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, so I'll start with a couple little asterisks. These are notes and caveats. First, it's a dynamic situation. Things change all the time. However, based on all the data, I don't see how it's going to get better, right? And I'm open to being wrong. Listen, people in 2001, when I said I'm going over to China to buy a bunch of stuff, people thought I was a moron. And I may still be a moron, but it worked out just fine. And now when I'm saying
millions of dollars later, you're good. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, we did okay. So when I say now, I'm sounding alarms. I think the bridge is out ahead. People are like, what do you mean? I keep sending product or sending money. I get product. What's the problem? So I'm looking into the future.
You're as pessimistic now as you were optimistic then.
That is correct.
21 years later.
That is correct.
Got it.
Very good way to think of it. So we, several years ago, particularly when the tariffs heated up, we really started getting aggressive on how do we diversify, because it's not just old Steve deciding where he's going to buy. My competition, if they can buy somewhere else and they don't have to pay that tariff, that's a huge edge for them. Whether it's a 7% or 7.5% or 15% or 25% tariff. If my competition is not paying that, I'm going to get hammered. Now, that assumes that there are viable options. China has 1.2 billion people. There is no replacement from China on a manufacturing industrial base. Even India has the people for it. In fact, India will pass China in population in the next 6 months. But they have no industrial base of similar nature. And their economy is completely disengaged from the rest of the world.
Yep.
They have no need to be a giant exporter to make their economy go around, for better or worse, right?
They have many ways consumer demand.
Correct. Yeah. So better or worse, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for them, is a secondary element. You can't just simply go, I'll just go over to India and hit the easy button there. Vietnam is 10 times smaller than China. Thailand 10 times smaller, roughly. So my whole point is that you're going to end up having to take pieces of this supply chain, and it's going to become more complex because you're going to take bites here and bites there. And we've done that. We've probably gone from 90+% in China, say 5 years ago, down to 60% today. And if it could be 0 today, it probably would be, but only if we can maintain velocity of movement of product and core overall pricing. Like, I'm not going to switch all of my stuff to the US and pay triple just so that I can have some feeling of, oh, good, I accomplished and I mitigated risk. That's never going to work. Yeah. So that paradigm of balancing and harmonizing total value, not just price, access, quality, likelihood they'll deliver on time, currency, all of these things have to be weighed in. And I Vietnam is certainly number one for a lot of categories, not all, but a lot of categories.
What are some of those categories?
Anything in heavy textiles, even light textiles. So anything, backpacks, shoes, sheets, draperies, any kind of coverings for, furniture, exterior for automotive or housing or, whatever. Tons and tons of stuff. India is really good at metalworks and really good at handicrafts. So anything made of metal, ironworks, brass,
what about
chrome.
wood products in India?
plenty of wood in Vietnam, India, Malaysia.
Okay.
So once you establish, and so like I used to do trips to China when I'd have time. I'm like, hey, just come along, pay your own way, and I'll just show you how I do business in China. It's fun for me. I take 10 or 20 people, and then we have a good time, and people learn. And by the way, I've even had people from China come on those trips with me, and they're like, holy crap, I never knew any of that. So some of it's just experience of doing it, but like cannot see the next time I will go to China or take people to China.
I mean,
But
it's too
I'll
risky,
do that.
right?
Yeah, do that in
Especially
other
after this
places.
podcast airs, you're going to be in trouble with President
Yeah,
Xi.
I could be on the blacklist at some point soon.
Yeah, I was talking to my wife. I said I can't see a time where I would take you to China or our kids. It's just not safe. Like it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I wouldn't think twice about it. It just seems crazy.
It's a shame. Honestly,
Yeah.
I wish it could go back to 2019.
I'm with you.
Where like everything was just fine. Like I used to love to go to Hong Kong, and I'd love to go to China and have some of the best meals and experience of my life.
Yeah.
And sharing that with people. I was able, luckily in 2019, to take my kids over there and get them into Hong Kong and throughout China, and we had a great time. But it is a different time. And this is, listen, I'm not even getting into the politics of it. I'm talking about geopolitical realities. I'm not even making policy decisions or judgments. I'm just telling you, here's how it's affecting the business world. And you can choose to pay attention or choose to ignore it. Either way, the consequences come thusly.
Is the regime strong enough to withstand these protests? I mean, are we looking at a future revolution or something else?
Well, this current unrest is called the White Paper Revolution. That's probably
Optimistic?
a little extra branding. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure revolution is what we have here. I will say this. In 10 years, I don't think that China exists in the same way it does today. As a country, as a CCP, in
Something
10 years,
from now.
I don't think it exists.
Wow.
There are too many structural things that are likely to disintegrate and go wrong. That said, they got plenty of power and even access to short-term capital to quash whatever this is.
Yeah.
And
That's the sad part from my perspective.
it's going to be a beatdown, and it will be. And by the way, it's extraordinarily directed at Xi Jinping personally. Yeah. When somebody is chanting, Xi Jinping, F your mother, this is not something that he can look away from. Like he has to deal with this head on. Yeah. So I would expect, should these things continue, and I expect that they will nightly, to be a heavy, heavy beatdown. There's already been many, many people arrested and so forth, and they typically have to sign a thing. I was wrong. I'm not going to do this again. Those are the ones who don't get hauled away for retraining.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm getting already feeling sort of the same feeling I had watching Hong Kong fall, and all of those incredibly brave freedom patriots who have been destroyed. If those who couldn't get out have been just destroyed, and I fear the same will happen with the white paper revolution. It sounds like not really a revolution, but it sounds like there's going to be significant repercussions coming, and it's sad. And so we'll put a bookend on that for now, Steve. I want to come back to, I think you make a really good point. If you think that you can pick up out of China, if you're 80%, 90%, everything you're doing right now as an Amazon brand or a Walmart brand or just a brand in general, is if all of that is coming out of China right now, there is no alternative to replace all of that. What you're going to have to do is break that puzzle up, send some of it to India, Malaysia, Indonesia, some of it to Vietnam, some of it in, some of it to maybe even the Philippines. Maybe some of these other more free-oriented countries will have an opportunity to pick up some of this demand. But boy, there's no easy option, is there?
You're going from the easy Alibaba button to making a quilt from things you find randomly, right? So I will tell people, understand your raw materials. You must understand where your raw materials are sourced from and where your target sales market are, and try to get those as close as you can together.
Yep.
To the extent that's not available and you have to import raw materials, then try to find flows that make sense.
Yeah.
Russia is still a giant problem. Ukraine is still a giant problem in that whole region. This will not be the last kinetic war, by the way. As the world disengages, there are going to be other problems. And all of those have a sense of disruption. So if you can buy in Mexico and sell in the United States, this is a smart thing to do. But it is not easy. And I will tell you, every country, whether it's Vietnam or Mexico, Thailand, Malaysia, India, anybody who's really in that export business has a line out their door of people wanting to buy from them. Yeah. So the longer you wait and the less you're willing to invest in what the future looks like, you're going to be, at the back of the bus wondering when you get fed, because it ain't going to be first.
Yeah, Steve, I remember trying to do this in my own business years ago. I really just thought logically that setting up factories or working with factories in Mexico, I was in LA. So it was so easy to go down to Mexico compared to the gazillion hour flight to China. And then, I had a lot of, it's just an uncomfortable trip. It's not a very fun trip. And then you come back and you lose a few days just sort of recovering from the jet lag. And I remember how hard it was. The Mexico south of the border is not set up like China. In other words, there just aren't contract factories where the government comes in and supports an entrepreneur to build a factory to make products for many brands. It was, if I wanted to come over there and make my own factories, which I didn't know how to do, I think the term is maquilador. If you wanted to come down and build your own factory, there was a lot of support for that, but not on the same level. And then even if I did get it, and I got really close to doing it, building a factory that would make game tables for our brand, then we still had the problem of every single part that we need. Guess where it had to come from? China, parts. And the same story with Taiwan, moving factories back to Taiwan, the same story into Vietnam. Even if you can get the finished goods made in a certain country, you still needed to bring parts in from China. Is that still the case?
It is evolving. So I can tell you it is a great renaissance in Mexico and Texas, for that matter, and other parts of the south of the United States. If the raw material is North American based, Mexico and the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, will be major producers in the future. Okay. If it is an imported raw material, but you can get that raw material from the Western Hemisphere, Colombia, Venezuela, whatever, now you still have kind of a zone of influence that you can control, and that is evolving very quickly. People need, like Monterrey, Mexico is a beautiful, amazing place if you understand how to work it. But you're right, you're going to have to build relationships. You're going to have to start finding people who are willing to take steps. You're going to have to teach them what you need. In some cases, we will buy the equipment they need, put it on the floor, train them how to make it. Here's what we want, and work with them in that partnership way, just like we did in China 20 years ago, by the way. This is how it was in China 20 years ago.
It was like this, okay.
For sure it was. Anybody who thinks that they just suddenly woke up one day and were awesome is absolutely uninformed. We had to do the same stuff in China, buying equipment from Germany or US or Canada. Now they make all the equipment in China. So instead of buying raw materials, if you can source raw materials outside of China, you'll be obviously better off, because the lockdowns and the supply chain disruptions and all the problems, those are problematic. And I want to, we're running out of time, but I just want to say problems in supply chain are not unique to China or solely exclusive to China, but they're certainly the most impactful. The United States has a potential railroad strike coming up in December. That's going to be a big problem for the United States. The West Coast of the United States has no contract for its port unions. That's a potential problem. Yeah. And I could go on about Australia and Korea and other places that have these things.
And we have our own inflationary labor force problems here in the United States as well.
For sure. Now, because we don't have time to get into it all, I can say Mexico has really, really great demographics and has huge potential for the United States, but it will take time, and you will be sucking hind tit if you wait forever, right? Everybody who wants to wait for somebody else to solve all these problems, fine, but you're at the back of the line when it comes to future product outputs and so forth. And I for sure know that we're spending more time and money on product development, sourcing, and things like that than we used to. So we raise our price, right? You have to pay for this somehow. That's an inflationary pressure for us all, but it's an investment that I don't think we can get around. And I know that investment, it already has. Like Vietnam, if we didn't have that during the Chinese problem, we would have been really worse off than we are today. And as a result, some of those hedge moves that we made have paid off, and we're continuing to double down on some of those moves, whether it's Taiwan or Korea. Again, if you look at the ASEAN region, including Vietnam, huge potential. Turkey, some potential.
Sure.
I think they have
Certainly
huge
in
potential.
textiles, it already owns the textile business there for Europe.
They're really great, but their economy has problems. So anyway, there's opportunity everywhere. Yeah.
It seems like we're in the age of the dictators, the resurgent dictators. This is probably a topic for another podcast, but I had some interesting conversations in I belong to the CEO project, and we have quarterly meetings, and I met a very interesting gentleman who does 3D printing. His business buys these enormous machines, and they're setting up 3D printing for mass production. And might robotics and 3D printing make it possible to bring more of that production at the right cost back here into the United States? And, it was pie in the sky when I tried to do it a decade ago. Bringing work back here into the United States and production back here in the United States just was a non-starter. There wasn't anyone willing to spend in our products at the quantity required to set up the investment for made in the USA products. But might technology fill in some gaps for you personally, for your production companies, but also for the US at large?
It is already happening to some extent. So yes, in some products, when the raw materials line up and the automation lines up, or the assembly and labor can be done in Mexico, because don't forget that the USMCA is quite a powerful, a lot of people know the term NAFTA. NAFTA has been replaced by USMCA, but it's very, very powerful, and it really treats Mexico as a true partner. Mexico is a huge trading partner for the United States. So between the labor being outsourced to Mexico and the automation and the technology and even raw materials being sourced to the United States or Canada, this is a huge potential for North American trade. And I guarantee you, in 10 years, people will see many more factories, even in 5 years, especially in Texas.
Yeah,
tons of factories, 3D printing, robotics, automation, and other things that you would have never imagined coming back that are already cheaper to make in the United States. The only thing that's not cheaper, so on a production basis, they can already be cheaper. It's the capital investment for the factory, which is sunk cost in China and has to be new cost. This is what you see in the chip manufacturing, right, and where the government's supporting them. But I will say that, yeah, it's going to be a renaissance of manufacturing. And that will also happen in Europe to some extent, certainly by leveraging places that are closer to Europe, like Turkey and so on. So the world will change, and all of this is bad news for China.
It really is bad news for China. And I'm right there with you, Steve. I've made so many friends over the last couple of decades. The Chinese people are amazing. I remember telling my wife and friends that, I don't know how many hundreds of visits I made to China, but, I always showed up at the airport or the train station, and there was always someone there to welcome me, give me a great meal. My heart really goes out to not only the protesters, but the Chinese people in general, because I think you're right. They're in for a decade of pain and suffering. Stephen, I'm sorry we ran over a little bit on time. I feel like we could keep going for a couple more hours, Steve. So we're going to have you back on the Day 2 podcast to see where this takes us. And, you're our official China expert and ASEAN expert here at the Day 2 podcast. I really appreciate your time. It sounds like the core message to brands and sellers and the entrepreneurs that you do so much for is act now. Don't wait. If you wait 5 years, it's too late. Start putting your quilt together with your patchwork of different countries based on different capabilities and start working on it now. Because if you wait a couple years, 3 years, 5 years, you're really in for a world of hurt. Did I summarize what you are recommending? And as you speak to entrepreneurs, what folks should be doing right now?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. The truth is, I love China. I love many of the people there, and we've had great experiences there. But it's a different time, and it's a different world that we're living in, and I have to adjust to it. And so does everyone else. Yeah. Like this is now. By the way, if this is just crazy old Steve, then everything will be fine, and don't worry about it.
Trust me, folks. It's not crazy old Steve. Steve is crazy like a fox.
Yeah, it's I wish, as I said, I could go back to 2019 and everything would be as it was. But that's just not reality. And my number one job, for fiduciary duty to shareholders and the people who work in the company and beyond is to make sure that I can predict and position the company for that future that we see. And that includes a diminishing role for China for lots of structural issues, right? I'm not taking a political stand here.
Sure.
But, if I actually applied my morality, I might actually go, Xinjiang, not cool, let's get out of there. But even for the structural reasons, we need to be realistic. And that is an economic reality that we will all face. And so, I wish the very best. I love entrepreneurs. I wish the very best for each entrepreneur. The smaller you are, the easier this will be to make adjustments, but is also the higher your risk is on some singular event being a big problem for you. So be advised and be thoughtful about your future.
And Steve, I mentioned some of the ways that folks can reach you through Empowery or awesomer.com. Is there any other things that our viewers should, if they want to reach out to you and ask you more about China or become part of some of your entrepreneurial training and speaking engagements, how can they reach you?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if you go to empowery.com, we do monthly masterminds that I will generally participate in where everybody can come and just ask questions. We talk about all kinds of things, everything in the Amazon e-commerce seller space, including how you get credit in China to, how do you price your product or do German packaging or things like that. So fun stuff. The awesomers.com podcast, I will rant and rave routinely there. And I have done many episodes about China and Mexico and Vietnam and other places. If you can find me on Twitter, it's at Steve Simonson. And I'm probably that same name on other social media as well. And, listen, I love entrepreneurs. I don't do one-to-one help per se, but I'm always an advocate for entrepreneurs. So if you find me and we can, high-five each other and have a chat, please look me up.
Steve, thanks for being on the Day 2 podcast, and thanks for all you do to support the entrepreneur community and small businesses, which, I think you and I both agree, without small businesses is what drives this country. And I love what you do. So thanks for all that you do, Steve, and thanks again for being here. So just to recap, folks, China is a hot mess right now. And if you are dependent upon China for your supply chain, start diversifying now. Peak China, according to our friend and expert, Steve Simonson, is over. He was there in 2001 when everyone said you were crazy to be in China. And he's ahead of the pack again, based on his real world experience and real world data saying that China, the way it was back in 2019, is over and it ain't coming back. The Alibaba button to get your stuff sent to your door is diminishing fast. And it's time to start building your quilt and diversifying your supply chain to many countries, whether that be India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Mexico, and even here in the United States. So thanks as always, Steve, for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. And remember, folks, if you're ready to start growing and protecting your brand on Amazon with a team of experienced Amazon operators, you can visit us at day2podcast.com. That's day2podcast.com, where you can also go to download our free Amazon checklist to make sure you're covering all your bases. Lastly, if you know of anyone else who would gain value from this podcast, please share it with them. Thanks for listening. Good luck navigating this supply chain of the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll bring Steve back repeatedly to keep you guys snapped in on what you should be doing to protect your business. Happy selling, everybody.